Hey, welcome back. So, psychosomatics, right? So there's psychosomatic physiology, neurophysiology, and now we've got the cognitive, psychosocial evaluations of contexts and conditions, social issues, life experiences, adverse experiences during formative development. We've got a psychiatrist, Jeff Solomon, who first used the term psychoimmunology. Let's see, Adder and Cohen looked at conditioning. They were able to discover conditioning of the immune response. Work by H. Besedovsky et al. And D. Felton at Indiana University. Continued developments until Candace Pert et al.'s work in 1985, when she identified neuropeptide receptors linking the brain and the cell walls of the immune system. Right, so there's some of the work that has gone into psychosomatic medicine, the biology of it. And so we've got clinical accounts of spiritual, religious, and transpersonal resources that range from it. Right, we've got Herbert Benson's pioneering work when he studied transcendental meditation for his 1972 book, The Relaxation Response, right, which is actually a health-related response that he identified that contrasts with the stress response, the fight or flight response, right? So the relaxation response. Carl Simonton started his cancer clinic with his wife Stephanie in 1971 using visualization and support group techniques. And they've written, or he wrote, and they wrote one book together, and there's a second book that Dr. Simonton wrote. More recently, the Mayo Clinic also promotes mind-body techniques. There is Harvard Medical School's J.D. Rediger, who has been studying the so-called spontaneous remissions and looking at the positive beliefs structures that include often spiritual practices in those kind of terms that are used by the medical community, the mainstream medical community, that eliminates any kind of psychosomatic relevance and the components of that. There's also a terminology that's used called the regression to the mean when people evaluate, some skeptics evaluate the situation that also denies or doesn't really recognize the psychosocial and cultural components of an individual's healing response. So, what else do we have here? So there's a series of testimonies that involve medical observation that are worth knowing about to help build familiarity with this kind of phenomena. There's Marlene Clapis, whose Vision Prayer Church sequence is very interesting, and it was during her suffering since birth from cerebral palsy. Right? It's brain damage. It's a brain damage condition that she had, that people have, and that she had, like other people, since birth. And so she became a Christian at 12 as a girl, and then over time then had this experience finally when she was finally reaching a crisis in her at around age 20 or so. And she was at the Mayo Clinic, who was there to then observe the before and the after of her condition, with her testimony then being explaining the steps of her experience and that happened between those medically observed points in her condition and recovery. There's also then Bill Owens' healing. That was in a testimony given to It's a Miracle, the It's a Miracle show at a hospital. He had liver failure, and a group of friends engaged in Episcopalian prayer around his hospital bed that resulted in his healing. That was associated and correlated and followed by his healing in a situation in which the medical community had been unable to provide relief and help other than the basics. So, additional stories include, and testimonies include Louise Hay's account of her healing herself, well, in a process of holistic treatment by getting particularly pillow-hitting emotional release psychotherapy along with her ministerial studies, out of which she developed her transpersonal kind of affirmational self-care message technique based on the Church of Religious Science ministry. And then there's the whole medical clinic at Catholic Lourdes with many interesting cases, particularly in a book by Louis Melmadrona where Dr. Larry Dossi gives goes through a series of those examples, of those cases. Very interesting stuff from the Catholic perspective there. And so, Harvard Medical School has had symposiums, and I mentioned some to you earlier about Neil Krauss. 3,000 studies Dr. Krauss or Mr. Krauss was mentioning, or Professor Krauss was mentioning. 3,000 studies suggest that religion is likely to have stimulating benefits for people's health. But as he quote-unquote states, belief in a deity engenders hope, which has been linked to positive physiological changes. Those who regularly attend religious services benefit from a community that is there to help members cope in difficult times. Who else? T.A. Balboni, MD et al. At the Harvard School of Public Health concluded that more explicit focus on spirituality, often considered outside the realm of modern medicine, could improve person-centered approaches to well-being, long sought by patients and clinicians. And there are more examples than that, in addition to that. And so, given those kind of supportive testimonies and perspectives, medical perspectives, we can then evaluate statements from the Azusa Street Revival, for example. There's a resource I found in which there's a testimony by two African Americans, two 70-year-old African Americans, a Mattie Cummings and a Reverend Lawrence Catley, who were young kids at the Azusa Street Revival in 1906 for a few years, who experienced healing from deafness and from tuberculosis. Those kind of testimonies then can be contextualized since they have no apparent underlying agenda, sort of a hidden agenda, other than to share freely and express their experience of spiritual healing. All right, so then that all brings us back basically to Sherry Kaplan. I've already mentioned a number of perspectives and resources that offer resources. Oh, I guess I should mention the Christian Science one. Louise Hay, then, is part of the Church of Religious Science, is linked to Joseph Murphy, who's a popular author, who passed away years ago, but his books are still popular in terms of the power of the subconscious mind. But he is also based and related to this spiritual, transpersonal kind of perspective that Louise Hay demonstrated, that is based in the churches of religious science and divine science. And both of those perspectives were derived from the original Church of Christian Science, founded by Mary Baker Eddy, for which there are many testimonies that are worth looking at. So, I'm just going to wind up here looking at and return to the reference of Dr. Gail Ironson's studies at the University of Miami, with, for example, a particular case of Sherry Kaplan, who demonstrated how God-related resources, God-related practices, spiritual and religious, have been identified with positive immune response in HIV. And so with coronavirus and the flu, and for all kinds of conditions, that's what we're talking about. That's what a spiritual, theistic, religious life can offer, particularly in modern society, with founding influences like Thomas Jefferson's freedom of religion, that gives us freedom outside any particular denominational doctrine, with the benefits of the university culture that is also itself ultimately a Christian, secularized Christian, is developing secularized Christian perspectives. All right, thanks. See you now.